There's a moment, and almost everyone who has been through it can pinpoint it exactly, when a person looks back on a relationship, a friendship, a job, a marriage, and realizes with a kind of vertigo that they no longer recognize who they were before it started. They apologized for things that weren't their fault. They second-guessed memories they used to trust completely. They found themselves again and again working harder to keep someone else happy than that person ever worked to keep them safe. And the strangest part, the part almost no one can explain when they finally tell the story, is that they can't identify a single moment where it went wrong. There was no dramatic turn, no obvious warning sign, no villain twirling a mustache, just a slow, almost invisible erosion, so gradual that by the time they noticed the ground was gone, they'd already been falling for years. This is the signature of psychological manipulation, and it is far more common, far more subtle, and far more scientifically understood than most people realize. Tonight, we go inside the minds of the people who do this, not to vilify them into cartoon villains, but to understand, with real clinical precision, how an ordinary human mind learns to bend other minds without ever raising its voice, and how the rest of us can finally learn to see it happening before it's too late. To understand manipulation, you first have to separate it from something it's constantly confused with: conflict. Every relationship involves disagreement, persuasion, even occasional unfairness. That's not manipulation. Manipulation has a specific defining feature that researchers who study it return to again and again. It operates covertly. Its entire function depends on the target not recognizing it as an influence attempt in the first place. A direct request, even an unreasonable one, gives the other person full information and a fair chance to say no. Manipulation is deliberately built to remove that fair chance while making the target believe they still have it, and this single. A distinction is why manipulation is so much harder to detect, name, and resist than ordinary conflict. Psychologists studying interpersonal influence describe it as a hidden agenda wrapped in an innocent-looking package, and the sophistication of that packaging is precisely what separates an amateur manipulator from someone who has, whether consciously or not, become genuinely skilled at it. The place to start is not with strategy, but with the mind doing the manipulating, because contrary to popular imagination, most manipulators are not cackling masterminds who wake up each day plotting the psychological destruction of the people around them. Clinical research into manipulative behavior points overwhelmingly toward a cluster of personality traits researchers call the dark triad: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, three distinct but overlapping tendencies that, in combination, predict manipulative behavior with striking consistency across study after study. Narcissism supplies the fuel, an inflated, fragile sense of self that requires constant external validation and reacts to any threat to that self-image with disproportionate defensiveness or aggression. Machiavellianism supplies the method, a cold, strategic, almost transactional view of other people as instruments to be used rather than individuals with their own interests. And psychopathy, in its subclinical, everyday form, far more common than the dramatic criminal stereotype most people imagine, supplies something perhaps most crucial of all: a genuine deficit in the felt experience of others' distress, allowing a person to cause real harm without the internal alarm bells that would stop most people cold. It's worth pausing on that last point, because it overturns a common assumption. Most people believe manipulators know exactly how much pain they're causing and simply don't care. The research suggests something stranger and, in some ways, more unsettling. Many high dark triad individuals don't experience the emotional signal that would normally translate into empathy at all. It isn't that the alarm is ringing and being ignored. For a significant number of them, the alarm was never wired to ring in the first place. But biology and personality only explain part of the story, because manipulative patterns, like so many things in human psychology, are also learned, often astonishingly early, and often in households that look, from the outside, nothing like the breeding ground for manipulation that people imagine. Developmental psychologists tracking the origins of manipulative behavior have found two starkly different paths that arrive at surprisingly similar destinations. The first path runs through neglect and inconsistency, a childhood where a parent's attention, withdrawal the next, followed by an unexpected burst of attention, just intense enough to make everything before it feel worth enduring, becomes locked into a psychological loop nearly identical to the one that keeps a gambler pulling a slot machine lever long after the losses have outpaced the wins. This is precisely the mechanism behind what's colloquially known as the hot and cold treatment in manipulative relationships. And it is not accidental incompetence at maintaining a relationship. Whether consciously calculated or not, it functions as one of the most powerful conditioning tools discovered in the entire field of behavioral psychology, and it explains why targets of manipulative partners so often describe an addiction-like inability to leave, chasing the intermittent high of approval long after the relationship has become, by any objective measure, a source of more pain than comfort. There is a third tactic, quieter and slower than the first two, that manipulation researchers consider in some ways the most dangerous precisely because it produces no single memorable incident a target can point to later. This is isolation, the gradual narrowing of a target's outside relationships and support network, rarely accomplished through an obvious demand, but almost always through a slow accumulation of subtle pressure. A critical comment about a friend here, a guilt-inducing reaction to time spent with family. There, a pattern of conflict that consistently seems to arise whenever the target makes plans without the manipulator present. Domestic violence researchers, who have studied isolation more rigorously than almost any other field because of its centrality to abusive relationships, have found that isolation typically precedes the most severe forms of psychological and physical control. And the reasoning behind this sequence is coldly logical once you see it laid out. A person surrounded by outside relationships has access to reality checks, other people who can say, gently or bluntly, that something in the relationship looks wrong. Remove those outside voices, one relationship at a time, slowly enough that the target rationalizes each individual loss as a personal choice rather than a pattern, and the manipulator becomes, over time, the target's primary OOR sole source of social feedback about their own life, at which point gaslighting and intermittent reinforcement no longer have to compete with any outside perspective at all. This raises a question the investigation has been circling since the beginning. If these tactics are this damaging, why don't targets simply notice them happening and walk away? The answer lies in one of the more counterintuitive findings in the entire field of manipulation research, and it concerns not the manipulator's cunning, but the target's decency. Studies profiling the targets of chronic manipulators have found they are not, as popular stereotype often suggests, unusually naive, weak-willed, or lacking in intelligence. If anything, the opposite pattern shows up with striking regularity. The people most susceptible to sustained manipulation tend to score higher than average on traits. By finding someone foolish, they succeed by finding someone whose empathy makes them instinctively generous with second chances, whose conscientiousness makes them quick to examine their own behavior for fault before questioning someone else's, and whose fundamental trust in people makes the explanation they didn't mean it, they're going through something, feel more plausible again and again than the far darker and more difficult truth. This is perhaps the cruelest irony this investigation uncovers. The very qualities that make someone a good partner, a good friend, a good employee, are frequently the exact qualities a skilled manipulator learns, consciously or not, to exploit most efficiently. There's a related mechanism worth understanding on its own terms, because it explains why so many targets of manipulation report a strange, persistent guilt that seems to attach to almost nothing concrete. Projection, the psychological process by which a person attributes their own unacceptable impulses, insecurities, or behaviors onto someone else, often the very person they're harming. A manipulator who is being unfaithful may become suddenly intensely suspicious of their partner's fidelity. A manipulator who lies frequently may become fixated on catching their partner in even the smallest, most innocent inconsistency. Clinical psychologists view this not as simple hypocrisy, but as a genuine, if unconscious, defense mechanism, a way of relocating an uncomfortable truth about the self onto someone else so it no longer has to be faced directly. For the target, the effect is deeply confusing, because the accusations often contain just enough plausible-sounding logic and are delivered with just enough apparent conviction that the target ends up defending themselves against a character flaw that was never theirs to begin with, while the manipulator quietly avoids ever having to examine the flaw that actually belongs to them. The workplace offers its own particular theater for these dynamics, and organizational psychologists have spent considerable effort mapping how manipulation operates differently in professional hierarchies than in personal relationships, largely because power in the workplace is formalized in ways it isn't at home. Researchers studying what's sometimes called corporate psychopathy have found that individuals with high dark triad traits are disproportionately represented not at the bottom of organizations, but often surprisingly high up. And the explanation for this uncomfortable pattern isn't mysterious once you understand what those traits actually optimize for in fact, be surface behaviors entirely disconnected from the underlying qualities, like honesty and long-term team cohesion, that actually predict organizational health over time. Studies tracking manipulative leaders over longer time frames tend to find a consistent pattern: strong short-term impressions, often strong short-term results too, followed by a slow accumulation of damage, elevated turnover among the most talented team members who tend to notice and object to manipulation faster than other S, declining trust, and organizational cultures that, over years, come to quietly reward self, promotion over substance, because that is the behavior that got rewarded at the top. Before any of these tactics can even begin, most manipulative relationships pass through a phase that, at the time, feels like the opposite of manipulation entirely, a phase researchers have come to call love bombing, though the same dynamic shows up in friendships, mentorships, and workplace relationships under different names. It is an initial period of overwhelming, almost disorienting warmth, constant attention, effusive praise, a sense of being seen and understood more completely and more quickly than anyone has ever managed before. Psychologists studying this pattern note that its intensity is not incidental. It serves two functions simultaneously, and both are strategic, even when the manipulator isn't consciously aware they're being strategic at all. First, it accelerates emotional attachment far beyond the pace a healthy relationship would normally develop, compressing months of trust building into weeks or even days, so that by the time any red flags appear, the target already feels too invested, too bonded, too grateful for what they received early on to walk away over what seems, in isolation, like a minor concern. Second, and more subtly, it establishes an emotional reference point, a peak of connection so intense that everything which follows, including outright mistreatment, gets measured against it, rather than against any objective standard of how a person deserves to be treated. Therapists who work with survivors of manipulative relationships describe this as one of the hardest patterns to explain to someone still inside it, because the early memory of being loved that intensely doesn't fade just because the treatment that followed it didn't match. If anything, it becomes the very thing keeping a target anchored to a relationship long after the evidence has turned overwhelmingly against staying. It's also worth drawing a distinction that clinical psychologists consider essential, and popular culture almost never gets right: the difference between overt and covert manipulation, because the stereotype of a manipulator, brash, dominant, obviously self-centered, only describes about half of the actual picture. Researchers studying narcissistic presentation have identified a second, quieter profile, sometimes called covert or vulnerable narcissism, built not around grandiosity and visible arrogance, but around a persistent performed fragility that manipulates through guilt and obligation rather than dominance and charm. This is the manipulator who frames every boundary set against them as a devastating betrayal, who responds to a partner's independence with wounded, tearful accusations of not caring enough, who positions themselves so consistently as the injured party that the people around them spend enormous energy managing their feelings, and vanishingly little energy examining their behavior. Clinicians note that covert manipulation is, in some respects, harder to identify and escape than its overt counterpart precisely because it never looks like power being exercised at all. It looks like sensitivity, like woundedness, like a person who simply needs more reassurance than most, and the guilt a target feels for even suspecting manipulation from someone who appears this vulnerable is itself one of the most effective protections a covert manipulator has. There's also a specific and particularly insidious manipulation tactic that deserves its own attention because of how effectively it turns a target's own moral compass into a weapon against them. DARVO, an acronym clinical psychologists use to describe a defensive pattern in which a person accused of wrongdoing responds by denying the behavior, attacking the credibility or character of the person raising the concern, and reversing the roles of victim and offender, positioning themselves as the wronged party in the exchange. This pattern has been documented extensively in research on abusive relationships, and what makes it so effective is its almost judo-like use of the target's own fairness against them. A person who raises a legitimate concern, expecting either acknowledgement or reasonable disagreement, instead finds themselves suddenly on the defensive, apologizing for having brought up the issue at all, comforting the very person who wronged them, and precisely because it exploits something close to a universal human wiring. Most people are deeply uncomfortable being accused of causing harm, and manipulators skilled at DARVO have learned to trigger that discomfort in someone else at the exact moment they themselves are the one who should be answering for something. What makes all of this even harder to see clearly from the outside is a phenomenon researchers call the manipulator's public mask. The consistent finding across numerous studies that individuals high in dark triad traits are frequently perceived by casual acquaintances, coworkers, and even first-time observers as more likable, more competent, and more trustworthy than the average person, at least during initial encounters. This isn't a coincidence or a fluke of individual charisma. It's a measurable, replicated effect, and it means that the people most likely to sound the alarm about a manipulator's true nature are, almost by definition, the people who know them best, and have been exposed to the pattern over the longest period of time. Precisely the people a skilled manipulator has the strongest incentive to isolate, discredit, or dismiss as biased, jealous, or unstable. This creates a genuinely disorienting social trap for targets trying to warn others. The manipulator often. It's worth zooming out for a moment to see how these same mechanisms scale far beyond individual relationships. Because researchers studying mass persuasion, propaganda, and cult dynamics have found the exact same psychological levers at work, simply applied to groups instead of individuals. Cult researchers, in particular, describe recruitment and retention processes that mirror interpersonal manipulation almost exactly. An initial love-bombing phase in which new members are showered with belonging and attention. Many of them have never experienced before, followed by a gradual narrowing of outside relationships, followed by an environment of intermittent approval and disapproval from leadership that keeps members chasing validation rather than questioning the structure providing it. Historians studying propaganda campaigns note a similar pattern operating at the level of entire populations, an US versus them framing that manufactures a sense of persecution or victimhood, discrediting outside sources of information the way a manipulative partner discredits a target's friends and family, and rewarding loyalty with intermittent, often public displays of approval. None of this is coincidental. The same nervous system, the same attachment wiring, the same vulnerability to intermittent reinforcement and isolation that makes one person susceptible to a manipulative partner is, at scale, exactly what makes populations susceptible to authoritarian movements and high control groups. Understanding manipulation at the interpersonal level, it turns out, is also a primer for recognizing it at every larger scale it operates on. Understanding all of this leads to a question that matters far more than simply cataloging tactics. What actually works to resist manipulation, or to recover after it's already taken hold? Clinical research on this point converges on something that initially sounds almost too simple to be useful, but which therapists specializing in recovery from manipulative relationships describe as genuinely transformative in practice: externalizing reality. Because manipulation depends fundamentally on isolating a target from outside perspective and eroding trust in their own perception. The single most protective factor identified across study after study is maintaining, or rebuilding, a small circle of outside relationships whose observations can't be controlled or distorted by the manipulator, and developing the habit of writing things down, dates, specific words used, specific incidents, in real time, rather than relying on memory alone precisely. Because memory is the exact terrain gaslighting is designed to compromise, therapists also point to a subtler but equally important shift: learning to evaluate a relationship not by its best moments, the intermittent bursts of warmth that keep a target hoping, but by its baseline, the ordinary, unremarkable texture of daily interaction when nothing dramatic is happening at all, because the peaks in a manipulative relationship are frequently engineered specifically to be memorable enough to outweigh, in the target's mind, a baseline that would otherwise be recognized as unacceptable. And here, finally, the investigation arrives at its most uncomfortable and most necessary conclusion. Because understanding the dark psychology of manipulation was never really about the manipulators at all, it's about recognizing that the qualities most of us are taught, correctly, to value in ourselves and in each other: empathy, patience, the willingness to see the best in people, the instinct to examine our own behavior before condemning someone else's, are the very same qualities that, without a shield of awareness, leave us most exposed. This isn't a reason to become suspicious of everyone or to armor the heart against connection altogether. It's a reason to hold two truths at once: that most people are not manipulators, and that the ones who are have learned, whether through a childhood of scarcity, a childhood of excess, or a nervous system wired from birth without the felt urgency of others' pain, to speak fluently in the exact language decent people are least equipped to defend against. Somewhere tonight, Mask doesn't just explain how they got there. It hands them, perhaps for the first time, the one thing manipulation is specifically engineered to take away: the ability to trust their own eyes again,